I should be gratefully allowed to speak.
It's Christmas Eve in 1973, and an elderly professor and icon of Indian science is giving what would turn out to be his final public speech to a captive audience at the Calcutta Mathematical Society.
50 years ago, when we were young, we had one great idea that we had to bring to the world, that Indian science was not less than anybody else, and therefore we were anxious to show our own experience, our own ingenuity, and to say something which people would record. How well we felt the Indian spirit. And 50 years after, when I find the country still remembers that someone 50 years ago had started the ball rolling, I feel really grateful. Gentlemen, I feel at the age of 80.
This programme is all about the extraordinary life of the Indian professor Satyendra Nath, or SN Bose. My interest in Bose was sparked off when I came across an article on the web about him. Now, I recognised his name because one of the things I remember from studying physics at university is that all particles can be grouped into just two families, one of which, bosons, are named in honour of Bose. But that, together with a hazy memory of seeing a photograph of a white-haired old man, which, to be honest, I'd found rather scary, was pretty much my sum total of knowledge about him. The more I read on this website, the more agitated I became. Here was a man who had influenced India both socially and politically. He transcended science, literature and music. He'd inspired the poet Tagore. He'd worked with Marie Curie and Einstein, and had helped change the face of 20th century science. And yet, unlike Einstein and Curie, almost nobody outside science, certainly in the West, has heard of him. So this programme is my attempt to find out much more about SN Bose by speaking to the people who knew him.
Right, hello.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, lovely to meet you.
One of these is Falguni Sarkar, who has spent the last 10 years researching the life of Bose. Although his interest is somewhat more personal than mine. Bose was his grandfather.
These are just a collection of pictures that my mother has, and I've scanned them. So
now, if I may be so bold, how old was your grandpa when that was taken, and how old are you now?
So he was, 24, 1925, maybe 25 plus, say about 31 or 32. And how am I now? I'm 38.
You do look very alike.
Yeah, people say that.
So what was it about your grandfather that made you want to research into his life like you've done?
Well, all my life I've been told, oh, he was famous, he worked with Einstein and things like that. And when I was a child, growing up, I used to tell people that. And none of my friends' parents knew of him or anything. And so it was always like, well, he must not have been so famous if my friends' parents don't know him. And then as I read more and put it in the kind of context of the history of science and all the things that were happening in the early part of the century, it became more obvious to me that there was a kind of significant contribution there. But aside from the science part of it, which gave him world prominence, just the stories I heard from family and people who knew him seemed like a unique individual.
I'm Purnima Sinha speaking. I was born in 1927, so I am now a 77-year-old woman. I met Professor S.N. Bose as a student of pure physics in 1948. He was a very attractive person, white hair, very lovable person and flowing in kindness. Best thing about him was his capacity for love for all kinds of people from the highest rank to the lowest level.
I'm Professor Partha Ghosh, a former student of Professor S.N. Bose. I did my Ph.D. with him. The thing that struck me was the combination of the intellect and the heart. And he was a polymath, and he was in the world of literature, music, he was everywhere.
I am Swapan Chattopadhyay. I am a scientist and a physicist and a laboratory director and an admirer of Professor Bose. Bose has an enormous legacy. I mean, he does. I mean, in India, his legacy is huge. He was more than just a physicist who has contributed fundamentally to physics. India as an independent state came to grips with the fact that, hey, we have intellects and minds that can come up to the world-class level.
Bose had been an outstanding student, and by the time he was in his 20s, he was lecturing physics at Calcutta University. His skills in languages, as well as in mathematics and science, had enabled him, along with a colleague, to translate Einstein's groundbreaking papers on relativity from German into English for the first time. It was when Bose moved from Calcutta to Dhaka University, though, that he really made his name.
Mid-19th century, towards late 19th century, physicists thought that they had it all. They need a fundamental theory of how things work. And then things went awry with a whole bunch of phenomena. First of all, they could not quite reconcile the fact that when an object is very hot, then it emits radiation in the form of heat. And it's called black body radiation. And the radiation has a certain number of colors and a certain distribution of these colors. And they could not explain the actual distribution of colors from classical physics.
In 1900, the German physicist Max Planck proposed a revolutionary concept. Instead of light being emitted as a continuous flow of energy like water flowing in a stream, Planck suggested that light was absorbed and emitted in the form of separate particles or quanta of energy, which were later dubbed photons. Planck summed his concept up in a law that tallied with the observations of blackbody radiation. But some of the mathematical arguments that led to the law were less than convincing. And this is where Bose comes in. When the young Bose read about Planck's work, he saw a way around these problems and set about deriving Planck's law in a totally different way to Planck himself. The mathematics and physics of the problem is difficult to understand. But don't worry, like many of the best ideas, Bose's insight was simplicity in itself. In essence, scientists first believed the photons were like classical particles, and so could be distinguished from one another. A bit like these three different notes played on the Esraj, an instrument that Bose himself played. But Bose suggested they were equally alike, so there was no way of telling them apart. Because the mathematics involved looking at the various ways in which the photons could be arranged, this made a huge difference, as our Esraj player will demonstrate. If he is allowed to play three classical type notes, which each have a different sound, there are 6 distinct ways of arranging these 3 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But if we make 2 of the notes Bose-like, so they are the same, then there are only 3 ways of arranging them. 1, 2, 3. Of course, Bose applied this idea not to musical notes on an Esraj, but to the problem of blackbody radiation. And like Planck's introduction of the concept of quanta, Bose's notion of the indistinguishability of identical particles became one of the foundations of quantum theory.
He wrote the paper in late 23, 24, and he sends it to the British Philosophical Magazine. And it was rejected. And so at that point, kind of being young and brash, he basically sent it directly to Einstein.
Dhaka University, 1924. Respected Sir, I have ventured to send you the accompanying article for your perusal and opinion. I am anxious to know what you think of it. If you think that the paper is worth publication, I shall be grateful if you arrange for its publication in Zeitschrift für Physik.
And at that time, Einstein was a celebrity scientist, and everybody wanted to write to him.
Though a complete stranger to you, I do not feel any hesitation in making such a request, because we are all your pupils. I do not know whether you still remember that somebody from Calcutta asked your permission to translate your papers on relativity in English. You acceded to that request. The book has since been published. I was the one who translated your paper. Yours faithfully, SN Bose.
Einstein was impressed with Bose's work, so he translated it and sent it into the journal, with a note saying what an important step forward he considered it to be. Perhaps not surprisingly, with an endorsement like that, Bose's paper was published. Einstein didn't stop there, though. He actually changed the course of his own research for a while and extended Bose's work to cover certain types of atoms. Their combined efforts are known as Bose Einstein Statistics, and the particles that obey these statistics are called bosons.
He never liked to talk about himself. He never talked about Bose statistics. He mentioned it as photon statistics. Everybody in the world knew that it was Bose statistics. He didn't care.
Bose applied for a visa to go to Europe, and they weren't going to give him a visa. And he wrote to Einstein saying, well, I need your backing. And so Einstein just sent a postcard saying this man should be given a visa. He made a significant contribution. So based on that postcard, he was able to get a visa, and that's when he went to Europe. And he worked in Madame Curie's lab and knew Maurice de Broglie and Sullivan Levy and all the kind. He was able to kind of meet the leading intellectuals of the day.
Madame Curie, that was a very humorous story. You know, didn't I tell you about Madame Curie? That old woman didn't let me tell her that I know French.
I went to Madame Curie with a letter of introduction. She greeted me affectionately. You will certainly get an opportunity to work with me, she said, but not right now. After 3 or 4 months. You have to learn the language first. Otherwise, you will find it difficult to carry on in the laboratory. She told me that I must meet a beautiful French woman whom I should learn from. So, we searched around Paris to find that beautiful woman. Actually, I knew French. I could read and write. But I couldn't tell Madame Curie, as she was talking incessantly.
There is one person that he met when he went to Paris, and they had a kind of lifelong correspondence, and this woman named Jacqueline Eisenman, who they became close friends, and they corresponded. So this was a letter when he was in Berlin, writing to her back in Paris.
Berlin, 1925. My sweet Jacqueline, your quick reply has gladdened me, but mixed with it is a feeling of sadness. It makes me think how little I have seen of you during this last stay.
Just kind of cursory introduction, and then he says,
everyone seems to be quite excited in Berlin about the way things have been going with physics. First and 28th last, Heisenberg spoke in the colloquium about his theory. Everybody is quite bewildered, and there is going to be very soon a discussion of the Schrödinger papers. Einstein seems quite excited about it. The other day, coming from the colloquium on the train, we found him jumping in the same compartment where we were, and forthwith he began to talk excitedly about the things we had just heard. We were all silent, but he talked almost all the time, unconscious of the interest and wonder that he was exciting in the minds of the other passengers. I'm glad that you liked the life of Buddha. I only looked at the first few pages, and I was a little afraid that you might not like it. It would have been such a pity. He's such a noble and outstanding figure. I wondered when you wanted to read his life. You never told me before. It is not, after all, such a thing to give you 2 more books. I don't know when they will reach you, and have just finished your Proust. More in my next. My best love, your Bose.
And it's interesting because here was a man who, he got married very young. My grandmother was, I think 11 when she was married, and he was 21. This is their wedding picture. So he was 21 and she was like 11.
I mean, it's quite strange looking at this wedding photo that there you've got your grandpa. He's having to kind of sit down on some little stool so that his child bride actually looks, a vaguely sensible size.
Exactly.
In comparison to him, because she's tiny, isn't she?
Yeah, and she was short generally. I mean, she was quite short woman, actually. And she survived into her 70s. He was an educated young man, and she didn't really know any English and wasn't very kind of educated, although she came from an educated family, so he taught her English. And when he found someone who could relate to, this one talks about the Buddha and Proust and spinning electrons and all that type of stuff. Clearly, this was somebody that, kind of gave him emotional sustenance through his period of feeling very alone and very removed from environment around him. But I guess it should be told that unlike Einstein, he was very committed to his family and he never left.
From Paris, Bose then moved on to Berlin. Any physicist visiting Berlin in the 1920s must have felt a bit like a musician visiting Liverpool in the 1960s. Some of the greatest minds of early 20th century science, including Einstein, who Bose soon met up with, were in the city arguing about the ins and outs of the strange new quantum theory that seemed almost too bizarre to comprehend.
In Berlin, never in your life will you get such a chance of meeting such great men of science. England has only mediocre people, barring a few. Moreover, they are incapable of appreciating our work because we are a subject race.
It was a height of the golden age, if you will. All the people were there, Heisenberg, Bohr, and all those folks. And some of his recollections, he talked about, being in these kind of seminars and things like that. But it's odd, there's no picture with him with Einstein. And I think what happened was that part of his personality was that he wasn't very kind of forceful and in-your-face type of person. I guess they had some disagreements, Einstein and he did, about certain issues and things.
I distinctly remember it was a hot afternoon. I had gone to his house and he was chatting with me, and he suddenly said,
I'll tell you something today, but you must not tell anybody else.
He got up and he closed all the doors and windows, and I didn't know why. He didn't want anybody else to hear what he was telling me. And he came close to me and said,
in this paper of mine, there is a factor of 2 missing that I derived. This comes from the photon spin, and I wrote it in.
And then he turned to me and said, in Bengal, let me just say it in Bengali first, and I'll translate it into English. He said, Buro kete dile, which means
the old man crossed it out.
So I said, what?
Yes, he crossed it out.
So I said, why didn't you tell him later when photon spin was discovered? Then he would have suddenly stood by you. And then came the punchline. He looked at me and said,
how does it matter who discovered it? It's been discovered, hasn't it?
So that's Bose.
Bose was the kind of person that was a kind of seeker of enlightenment and kind of the Indian personality of wanting a guru of sorts, and Einstein was the ultimate guru. He was probably the kind of person that was very uncomfortable with having somebody see him as a guru. Whenever Bose wrote to him, he wrote, Dear Master, and, the kind of typical Indian type of standing at the feet of the master, that type of thing. And I think that kind of thing made Einstein very uncomfortable. And so they never kind of emotionally kind of bonded, and I think Bose felt a little bit distant from that, or a little bit, hurt. And so he never really kind of exploited that and never really kind of took advantage of that.
Do you remember his study in his house at all?
Yes, and it's still there. There's a picture of Tagore on one wall and a picture of Einstein on another wall, and it still has a lot of his books, science books, but also books on French poetry and philosophy and Voltaire.
Do you think that's really a reflection of the times he lived in?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that it was a kind of time of pursuit of knowledge and a belief that there is a kind of unity in the universe of science and literature and music. He was an accomplished musician, so he played the esraj, which is like a sitar but with a bow, and he was known to have composed his own ragas.
There's a picture, of Einstein playing violin and Bose playing the esraj, 2 different pictures. I would like to draw an analogy of the 2 characters. Here you see the Bose's image is very, very interesting. He had this head full of white hair with streaked. It lends itself to pencil or etching, and the esraj is a very rectilinear instrument, sits vertically, and the bow is perfectly horizontal. So you have vertical lines, horizontal lines, and curved hair on the one side. And Einstein's image is a perfect chaos. He's holding the violin any way he wants, his hair is all over, and the contrast is incredible. At the same time, it's a point of unity. Well, the other thing in common, I would say, that they both actually contributed to the cause of certain people. I mean, Einstein was very much struggling with his identity. The same thing for Bose. I mean, Bose was very aware that he was in India that was struggling to find his identity and face.
Apparently, all through the early part of the century, the British government kept track of what's happening in the colonies, and so 50 years later, MI5 declassified all of their reports. So a few years ago, I was at the British Library, just kind of going through them, and I found one in 1924, and the subject was Indians and Afghans in Paris. There was a man named Abani Mukherjee who was deemed a terrorist by the British government, freedom fighter, and he was actually in Paris at the time. And so Bose knew his family back in Calcutta, and they said, well, you're going to Paris, take some money for him. And Bose agreed to do it. And so one of the entries on, I guess, November 15th, 24, S. Bose, a Bengali professor who has arrived in Paris. He has been sent by the Dhaka University to study physics. He is said to be a friend of Abani Mukherjee's family. So there were spies everywhere that, keeping track of when he landed.
How do you think your grandfather would have felt if he'd have known that, in fact, he had spies following him around Paris?
It's probably the time. They were obviously kind of colonized people. They were in the midst of, early parts of the struggle, or that's been going on for decades, I'm sure, at that time. It'd probably be kind of expected in some sense.
Bose's desire for his country to develop away from the influence of the British was perhaps most simply demonstrated in his attempts to encourage science to be taught in native languages rather than English.
Bose was very much impressed by Israel and Japan, where they created a scientific culture and contributions in science based around their own language.
But there was a lot of criticism about this, because people said, how will you ever be able to translate all that into Bengali? So one day, actually, I went and asked him, I said, sir, can you explain to me why you were so keyed up about it? And he gave me an answer which is so convincing. I never had any doubts left in my mind about it after that. He said, look,
I'm not talking about people like you who are actually doing science. I'm talking about the average Indian. Why should they learn a foreign language in order to learn the basic things that are happening in science?
And I think he turned to me and said, you should learn Russian as well.
My uncle, Bose's son, came to study in the States, and it was in one of his classes, a physics class, and they were talking about Bose, and one of the fellow students says, oh, well, this is Bose's son. And then the professor goes, don't be ridiculous, Bose was German. And he would not believe that this was, Bose's son.
Do you think the fact that he didn't tend to engage in much self-publicity, do you think that was a contributing factor to him never winning the Nobel Prize?
Many people who comment on that said, well, all it would have taken was one word from Einstein, and he would have had it. But he never really kind of sought that. And looking back on it, I'm not sure if it was kind of a fear of success or things like that.
Although Bose himself never won the Nobel Prize, his work has been recognised in this way. In 1925, Einstein had predicted that if a group of atoms governed by Bose Einstein Statistics were cooled to just a fraction above absolute zero, which is the lowest temperature that it's possible to reach, they would behave as if they were one single supersized atom. 70 years later, this peculiar behaviour was observed in a laboratory by Eric Cornell and Carl Wyman of the University of Colorado. They went on to share the 2001 Nobel Prize for Physics with Wolfgang Kettel from MIT, who had also produced a so-called Bose Einstein condensate from a gas of atoms.
If I can give an analogy of Bose Einstein condensation for a layperson, you've seen schools of fish, and sometimes the schools of fish are together but not quite. Each fish keeps its identity, and if you disturb one, that particular fish will change its direction, but the rest of the school just doing away their merry way. But then you have seen other types of schools of fish, they all go in one direction, and all of a sudden change its direction, all of them go in the other direction. And what happens is that the identity of one is linked to the identity of all the others in the school of fish. That the slightest disturbance to one fish means disturbance to the whole school of fish, and they make a collective decision to change. And you can change collective direction of a school of fish by simply touching one. And that's what happens in a Bose system.
You know, I mean, if you look at the kind of parallel in terms of the Bose Einstein condensation, there is a kind of a unity in the totality there, that where low enough temperatures, they become a new form of matter, where you kind of form a new entity in some sense. And I think if you look at it philosophically, I mean, I think that in a way, you know, his reach and his breadth of knowledge and influence in terms of people were just so wide that he, in essence, kind of disappeared into a larger entity of either the nation or his friends. And so, even though he as an individual isn't acknowledged on a pedestal, his ideas have permeated so much through science as that in itself is a monument. But it's not a monument, it's everywhere. So in a way, it's almost a metaphor or allegory or whatever of his life.
Gentlemen, I feel at the age of 80, the weight of the years.
Learning more about Bose has been a fascinating and moving experience. Fowle's memories of being wrapped in his grandpa's arms and Partha's tales of Bose's eccentric dress sense, along with everything we've just heard, have brought the man to life for me. I now know that Bose was so much more than a white-haired old physicist. He was a great scientist, but he was also a humanitarian, a linguist, a nationalist, a musician, and perhaps in the same way that he looked to Einstein as a father figure of science, India looked to him as theirs.
As a scientist, he was a super genius, but as a man, he was incomparable.
And in many of my thoughts and actions, I can't help remembering him and asking myself, would he have done this? Should I do this, being one of his students and things like that. So he has deeply influenced my life. He was a guru.
When I see young people around me who still really believe in the high ideals in India, still think that India has got something to play to the world, to give to the world, the spirit of cooperation and the love of humanity.